They called themselves the Miller Party. Not a big group, just three families: the Millers, the Clarks, and old Mr. Henderson, who traveled alone. They had two wagons, loaded heavy with what they hoped would build new lives. It was spring 1868. Or maybe it was early summer. The exact date got hazy later. People argued about it. But they were heading west. Everyone was. Utah was a stop, a place to gather strength, maybe resupply before pushing on to California. Or, for some, Utah was the promise itself, a new farm, land that was cheap or free. They had come a long way already. Missouri, then across the plains. They saw plenty of other wagons, dust trails stretching for miles. But by the time they hit the Utah Territory, things changed. The landscape got big. Really big. Open and empty. The trails thinned out. Other groups took different paths. The Miller Party found themselves more and more alone. Utah was a strange place. The red rocks shot up like towers. Valleys were wide and flat. The air felt thin and dry. When the sun was out, it burned. And it was out most days. They tried to keep moving in the mornings, taking breaks in the hottest part of the afternoon. Then they'd push again until it got dark. Water was always a worry. They carried barrels, but the barrels emptied fast. Sometimes they went a day without finding a good spring. The horses suffered. The people suffered too. And John Miller was the unofficial leader. He was a quiet man, strong hands. He had a wife, Sarah, and two young kids, a boy named Thomas and a girl, Emily. Sarah worried a lot. She watched the desert go by, mile after mile of nothing. She saw the way the land stretched out, endless. She heard the wind whispering through dry scrub. It wasn't like home. Not at all. The Clarks had a baby, still nursing. Martha Clark was always tired. Her husband, Ben, was good with a rifle, but even he looked worried sometimes. He'd scan the horizon, his eyes narrowed against the glare. The baby cried a lot, a thin wail that carried far in the quiet air. Old Mr. Henderson didn't say much. He just kept his wagon moving. He had a dog, a scruffy mutt named Rusty, who rode in the back, tongue lolling out. Mr. Henderson had seen a lot in his life, and he just kept his gaze fixed ahead. He trusted John Miller to know the way, or he hoped he did. They followed what was marked on their map as a cutoff. It promised to save days, a way through some mountains, then across a wide valley. The map was old, hand-drawn, a bit smudged in places. John Miller studied it every night by the campfire. He traced the faint lines with his finger. The cutoff looked direct, maybe too direct. He heard stories about cutoffs. Some were good, some were traps. The land started to change again. The mountains gave way to vast, flat plains of sand and scrub. Not the red rocks anymore, but something more bleached, more desolate. This was the real desert, they realized. The air grew still. The heat shimmered off the ground. It was like looking through wavy glass. One afternoon, the younger Clark boy, Samuel, about 5 years old, pointed to something far off. "Water," he shouted. Everyone looked. There, in the distance, was a shimmering lake. Blue. Inviting. They pushed the horses harder, but as they got closer, the lake stayed the same distance away. It didn't get bigger, it didn't get clearer. It was just an illusion, a mirage, the desert playing tricks. A heavy silence fell over the party. The hope that had flared died out. They kept moving. The sun dipped low, turning the sky orange, then purple. The air cooled some, but not enough. That night, they used the last of their good water for the animals. They barely had enough for themselves. Sarah held Emily close. Thomas shivered, even though it wasn't cold. He was scared. Everyone was. They were deep in it now. Too far to turn back. Too far to know what was ahead. The second day in the great flat desert was worse. The sun felt like a hammer on their heads. The ground baked hard. Every step the horses took kicked up dust that got in their eyes and throats. The water was almost gone. John Miller had to ration it out, cup by tiny cup. The children cried for more, but there was no more to give. The map showed a small spring, maybe, a day or two ahead. That was their hope. No, that was all they had. But the tracks they were following, faint as they were, started to vanish. The wind whipped up dust devils that spun across the plain, erasing any sign of a path. John Miller got down from his wagon, walked ahead, trying to find a clear way. He squinted at the horizon. Everything looked the same, endless, flat, empty. Then, just before noon, it happened. They were crossing a patch of ground that looked solid, but it wasn't. The front wheel of the miller's wagon hit a soft spot, a hidden ditch, or an old gully covered by sand. The wagon lurched. There was a sickening crack. The wagon tilted hard. The left front wheel had snapped. The axle broke clean through. Panic rose. Sarah gasped. The children screamed. Ben Clark rushed over. And John Miller stared at the broken wood. It was bad, really bad. They had spare parts, yes, but not for an axle. Not like this, and they were in the middle of nowhere. No trees for wood, no tools strong enough to fix such a break. "We can fix it," Ben Clark said, trying to sound confident, but his eyes were wide. He knew. John Miller knew too. It was beyond fixing, not out here. They spent hours trying. They unloaded the wagon, hoping to lighten it enough to somehow patch it. They tried to prop it up with rocks. Nothing worked. The wagon was stuck. It couldn't move. The sun beat down. The heat was immense. It drained their strength. The baby started to get sick, a feverish whimper. Martha Clark rocked him, tears streaming down her face. The old Mr. Henderson just watched, his face grim. Even Rusty the dog lay panting under the broken wagon, trying to find a scrap of shade. That evening they had a hard talk. They couldn't leave the wagon. Too much of their food, their supplies, their things were in it. But they couldn't stay. To stay was to die. "I can go ahead," John Miller said, "on horseback. Ride to that spring, come back with water, maybe find help." He looked at Sarah. She shook her head. No, she wouldn't let him go alone. What if he got lost? What if he didn't come back? "We all go," Ben Clark said. "We leave the wagon. We carry what we can. We walk to the spring." It was a desperate plan to walk across this desert with children, with a sick baby. But what else was there? They emptied the Miller wagon. They sorted through their possessions. What was truly necessary? Water skins, a few blankets, some dried meat, a rifle, ammunition. Everything else they left behind. It hurt to leave their things they had carried for hundreds of miles. Furniture, family heirlooms, tools. They had to. Life was more important than things. The next morning, they started walking. The Clarks' wagon, the only one left, carried the sick baby and what little water they had. The rest of them walked. John Miller led the way, eyes on the distant shimmer of the horizon. As Sarah carried Emily, Thomas walked beside her, holding her skirt. Ben Clark drove his wagon. Martha walked with him, holding onto the side. Mr. Henderson walked alone, Rusty trotting at his heels. The walking was terrible. The sand shifted under their feet. It was like walking on deep snow, but hot. Every step was an effort. The heat was worse than before. The air was still, not a breath of wind. The sky was a pale, blinding blue. By noon, the water was nearly gone again. The baby was worse. He cried in a weak, raspy sound. Martha Clark was almost frantic. Ben tried to calm her, but he was afraid too. He could see it in his eyes. They saw nothing else. No birds, no animals, just endless, flat ground. Dust. Sun. Despair. John Miller looked at his map again. The spring should be closer, but he couldn't tell for sure. All the landmarks looked the same. A small rise here, a distant ridge there, but they all blurred together. He stopped, scanning the horizon. He thought he saw something. A line of darker green. Trees, maybe. Far away, but it was hope. A tiny flicker. "That way," he said, pointing with a shaky hand. "I think that's it. They followed him. They had to. What else could they do?" The sun began its slow descent. The shadows lengthened, distorted. The desert started to play tricks on their minds. Were those figures on the horizon people, or just rocks? They pushed on, bodies aching, throats raw. The last drops of water were given to the baby. He barely drank. As darkness fell, they made camp. No fire. Just huddled together. The silence of the desert pressed in on them. A vast, heavy silence. They were truly alone now, and truly lost. The morning after they abandoned the broken wagon, things got even worse. The small patch of green John Miller thought he saw was just more scrub brush, no water. The air was thick with dust now. A wind had picked up overnight, blowing sand everywhere. It stung their eyes, it got in their food, in their mouths. The baby was very sick. His breathing was shallow, his skin hot. Martha Clark sobbed quietly, holding him tight. Ben Clark looked defeated. John Miller felt the weight of it all pressing down. He was supposed to lead them. He had made the decisions. And now they were here. They had to keep moving. Staying put meant certain death. They hoped the wind might die down, the dust might settle, but it didn't. It just blew harder. Sometimes they could barely see 20 feet in front of them. The Clark's wagon, still carrying most of their remaining supplies, and the sick baby became a hazy shape in the swirling sand. They walked for hours. The sun was a dull glow through the dust. They lost track of time. 1 hour bled into the next. They were all weak from thirst, from exhaustion. The children stumbled. Sarah carried Emily as long as she could. Then John took her. Thomas walked like a ghost, his eyes hollow. At some point, old Mr. Henderson, who had been walking steadily behind the Clark's wagon, called out. His voice was hoarse. Wait. John Miller stopped. Ben Clark stopped his wagon. The wind tore at their clothes. What is it? John shouted over the wind. Mr. Henderson pointed behind them, or tried to. His hand was shaking. The tracks, he said. They're gone. The wind. It's wiped them away. And John looked. He squinted back the way they had come. It was true. The sand was a shifting, blank canvas. No tracks, not their own, not the wagon's, nothing. They couldn't even retrace their steps if they wanted to. A wave of despair washed over them. They were truly lost now, not just in direction, but in time and space. They had no idea where they were coming from or where they were going. They pushed on a bit more, but it was clear they couldn't keep going blindly in the dust storm. They huddled behind the Clark's wagon. It offered some meager shelter from the wind, but the sand still got everywhere. They tried to eat some dried meat, but it was gritty and hard to swallow. The baby's breathing got worse. As Martha was crying openly now, holding him close, whispering to him. Ben sat beside her, his head in his hands. John Miller looked at Sarah. Her face was streaked with dirt and tears. Her eyes were red. He reached for her hand. It was cold. They talked in low voices about what to do. There were no good answers, no water, no sense of direction, no way out. We need to find shelter, Ben Clark said. Rock, anything. But there was nothing, just the flat, endless plain. The wind howled. It was a sound like a living thing. Later that day, the baby stopped crying. A terrible silence fell over Martha Clark. She just held him, rocking slowly. The storm raged around them, but in their small circle, a new, colder silence took hold. That night, they slept little. The wind didn't stop. They huddled together for warmth and comfort, but comfort was hard to find. They had lost one of their own. When the sun finally rose again, it was a blurred, weak light through the still present dust. The wind had lessened some, but the air was still thick. They were all stiff, aching. Their lips were cracked and bleeding. John Miller stood up. He looked at the vast, desolate landscape. He knew what he had to do. They couldn't leave the baby here. Not like this. They found a shallow dip in the sand. With their bare hands, they dug a small grave. Ben Clark said a prayer, his voice breaking. Martha stood, numb, watching them bury her child. It was a terrible, quiet moment in the middle of a vast, noisy desert. After that, something changed. The will to go on, for some, started to flicker. Old Mr. Henderson sat on the ground, leaning against his wagon wheel. He looked too tired to move. Rusty sat beside him, whining softly. We have to try, Sarah said, her voice weak but firm. For Emily. For Thomas. John nodded. They had to, but the spark was gone from his eyes. He pointed a direction, a guess more than a certainty. That way, he said. There has to be something. They walked again, slow, labored. The Clark's wagon groaned as it moved. The sun climbed higher. The dust clung to them. Sometime around midday, John Miller felt a strange shift in the air. The dust seemed to thin out a bit. He thought he saw something in the distance. Not a mirage this time. Something else. He pointed. Look. Ben Clark squinted. What is it? It looked like a structure. Very far away. A building, a settlement, a flicker of hope, desperate and fragile, stirred in John's chest. And he didn't say anything. He just started walking faster, pulling Emily along. They pushed harder. Hope can be a powerful, if fleeting, thing. They walked towards that distant shape, forcing their aching bodies forward. But the shape didn't get closer fast enough. The sun started to dip. The dust began to thicken again as the wind returned, stronger this time. It felt like the desert was closing in. They never reached that shape. As darkness fell, the dust storm swallowed them whole again. The last anyone ever saw of the Miller party and the Clarks and old Mr. Henderson was a faint, hazy silhouette of a single wagon and a few figures, swallowed by the swirling sand, somewhere deep in the desolate heart of the Utah desert. Their tracks, once again, wiped clean. Their presence erased. They were gone, just like that. News traveled slow back then, especially in the territories. It took weeks, sometimes months, for word to reach anyone. The Miller party was just one of many groups heading west. People expected to lose touch. They expected some to just disappear. The frontier was harsh, but a few weeks later, a different wagon train, bigger and more organized, passed through the same general area. They were careful. They had good guides. They heard whispers of a lost party. They saw the remnants of the broken Miller wagon. Its contents were scattered, picked over, but the wagon itself was undeniably broken. It sat there, a silent testament to a disaster. The bigger wagon train sent out a small scout party. Just 3 men on horseback. They rode for a day, tracing what faint signs they could find. They found the shallow burial site of the baby. The grave was marked by a few stacked stones, small and sad. So that confirmed it. A family had truly suffered here, but beyond the grave there was nothing. No other tracks, no other signs of the second wagon or the people. The wind and sand had done their work. The desert was a vast, blank slate. The scout party rode in circles for a few hours. They saw the same endless dunes, the same scrub. They found nothing else. They reported back to their wagon master. He knew the desert, he knew what he could do. He decided they couldn't spend more time searching. They had their own families to protect, their own journey to finish. It was a hard choice, but a necessary one. They said a prayer for the lost souls and moved on. Word eventually got to the small settlements in Utah. To Salt Lake City even. A lost party. A broken wagon. A baby buried in the sand. It wasn't uncommon, not really. People vanished all the time. But this one seemed to stick in some people's minds. Maybe it was the complete lack of other evidence. No bodies, no wreckage of the second wagon. Just one broken wagon and a small grave. The theories started, always do when people disappear. Some said Native Americans, bands of raiders, often desperate themselves, sometimes attacked lone wagons. But there was no sign of a fight. No arrows, no spent cartridges. And the native tribes in that specific area were usually less hostile, more focused on survival in a changing world. So that theory didn't hold much water. Others said they just got lost, died of thirst. The desert swallowed them. This was the most likely answer. The desert was immense. You could walk for days, wander in circles, and never find water. And bodies, when they were found, were often just bleached bones, sometimes scattered by animals. But no bones were ever found. Not a single trace of the adults. There were wilder stories, too. There's whispers among the old-timers, stories of strange lights in the desert, unexplained disappearances. Maybe the desert itself had just absorbed them, like a bad dream. Silly, most people said. But the stories persisted, because there was no good explanation. The small settlement of Willow Creek, which was roughly on the path the Miller party had planned to take, heard the rumors. A few men from Willow Creek, ranchers mostly, knew the desert better than most. They had explored it, hunted in it. They were practical. They decided to put together a small, informal search. Not a big organized thing, but a few men on horseback with plenty of water and supplies. They rode out a few weeks after the initial scout party. They found the broken wagon again. It was further damaged by weather, more scavenged. They found the small grave. They followed the faint trail of the second wagon for a bit, maybe a day's ride further. They picked up a few discarded items, a child's shoe, a faded bandana, small, heartbreaking clues. But then the trail just ended. Gone. Like the searchers hit an invisible wall, the land became too rocky, or too sandy, or the wind had just erased everything. They rode around for another day. They climbed small hills, scanning the horizon with field glasses. Nothing. Just the vast, empty desert. The ranchers, good, honest men, had to give up. They came back to Willow Creek, their faces grim. They reported what they found. What they didn't find. It was a mystery, they said. A deep one. The tale of the lost Miller party became a local legend. A campfire story. A warning to new arrivals about the dangers of the land. People would tell it in hushed tones, how a whole group of people, a family, just vanished. No trace, no answer. Just gone. The desert held its secrets tight. It was a powerful reminder that sometimes the land itself was the killer. And it left no evidence. Years passed, then decades. The Utah desert stayed the same. Harsh, beautiful, unforgiving. The story of the Miller party and the Clarks and old Mr. Henderson became one of those old tales. The kind people told, but nobody really knew the full truth of it. It was a mystery that never got solved. No more extensive searches were ever mounted. The area they disappeared in was just too remote, too vast, too difficult to navigate. And after a while, other events, other stories took over. The frontier kept moving. More people came, more towns were built, but the Miller party's fate remained a chilling blank space on the map of human experience. People would still talk about it sometimes, around a flickering fire or in the general store in a small town. Remember that group that just vanished, someone would say, and others would nod. Everyone knew the story, or at least a version of it, The theories never went away either. They just shifted. As time went on and people learned more about the land, some ideas gained more traction. The extreme heat and lack of water was the most likely killer. Delirium, disorientation, simply wandering off in different directions from exhaustion and madness. It made sense. People did that. But it still didn't explain the complete lack of bodies or other personal effects. If they had simply died of thirst, wouldn't their bones, their clothes, their wagon eventually be found? The desert winds moved things, uncovered things, but nothing from them. Some wondered if they had stumbled into some hidden canyon, a fissure in the earth, and were swallowed whole. The desert was full of such places, deep cuts in the rock, hidden by scrub and sand. A sudden drop, and they could have been gone forever. Their wagon too pulled down by shifting sands. It was a dark thought, but a possible one. And then there were the stranger ideas. Tales of the desert being home to ancient spirits or forgotten peoples. Not Native Americans, but something older, more mythical. These were often just campfire stories, meant to spook. But the enduring mystery, the sheer nothingness of their disappearance, fed these tales. The human mind hates a vacuum. It fills it with whatever it can imagine. What truly happened to the Miller party? We will probably never know. They were just people trying to make a new life. They faced the same hopes and fears as countless others on the westward journey. But for them, the journey ended not in a new home, but in an utter absolute disappearance. Their story is a stark reminder of how fragile life was on the frontier, how powerful and indifferent nature could be. The Utah desert, vast and silent, proved to be an ultimate adversary. It didn't just kill them, it erased them. It folded them into its ancient, unchanging landscape, leaving no trace. It speaks to the risks people took, the courage they had, and the terrible prices they sometimes paid. They gambled on a dream, and they lost everything. The desert kept their secret. It swallowed their wagons, their belongings, their bodies, and their stories. All that remains is the question, whispered across generations. Did a group of settlers disappear in the Utah desert? Yes. And nobody ever found out why, or how, or where. They just went, and the desert closed in behind them, a silent, empty canvas once more.